Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the launch of the Call It Out annual report for 23-24. My name is Lindon Coombes, and I'll be moderating the event today. I'm a Yuwalari man from northwest New South Wales. My family is mainly from Brewarrina there. I'd like to acknowledge them and that community up there who's currently dealing with some very tragic, sorry business. And yeah, I'm the director here at the Jumbunna Institute for Indigenous Education and Research at UTS. There's some housekeeping stuff. Today's event is being live captioned. To view the captions, click on the CC button in your Zoom control panel. If there's any problems, let us know in the chat box. So yeah, I'd like to start today by acknowledging the ongoing sovereignty and custodianship of First Nations people throughout Australia and their enduring connections to country. This land is and always will be Aboriginal land. I acknowledge the Gadigal people here where Jumbunna Research and UTS's main campus is located, and I pay my respects to our elders and to all First Nations people and communities across the country that are joining us here today. I also need to give a content warning. There is, some really confronting and difficult to hear things that will come up as part of our discussion today. And if you need to, please look after yourself, take a break, speak to somebody you trust, or contact one of the services that will be posted in the chat box. We'll have 13 Yarn, Brother to Brother Lifeline, and Beyond Blue contact details there. A couple of other quick things. Today's event will be recorded, and we'll email that link to the webinar after the event. And there's a link to the report in the chat, and I'm saying all this, I can't see if it is, but hopefully all that's happening behind the scenes, and we'll have 15 minutes for Q&A at the end of the discussion. So if you've got any questions, please, thank you, Asa. You can type those up in the chat, and we'll have a selection of those to go through with the panel at the end. So I guess we'll get to it. I was fortunate enough to be asked to write an introduction to this report. And I guess I noted in that I've been working in Aboriginal affairs for over 25 years, since the late 90s, and working in this space, I've developed a relatively thick skin, as I think many others have, when it comes to issues around racism, and a lot of the issues that Indigenous people experience in this country. But one of the things that kind of loomed large and really brought a new experience to me was the referendum. And you'll see in the report that is referenced a number of times, and a number of incidents are, I guess, attributed to that process and the way that it happened, its results, and the aftermath. And it was one of those moments that reminded me of the pain that racism causes. We can often be told, sticks and stones kind of advice pieces, but when it hits hard, and I certainly felt that, and I know that a lot of other Indigenous people felt that. We felt it in the work we do here at Jumbunna. We are often out and about all over the country talking to mob everywhere, We pride ourselves on being connected to our communities, to our organisations, and developing and maintaining our relationships there. But after the referendum, there was a very uneasy quiet that we felt in a lot of communities that we work with. And that was from some fatigue, and it was from hurt. And I kind of feel that we're now just really coming out of that kind of process, and that communities needed to take some time to digest that process, to heal, and to rethink how we pursue our ambitions, and who we pursue those ambitions with. And I know for me that it's given me a much stronger resolve as a result of that. And I get that feeling now in communities that, we're dusting ourselves off, getting back to work, and we're going to keep continuing making things better for ourselves and the generations that are to come. One of the other things I guess I'd say around this issue is people are often accused of seeing racism where there isn't any. And my argument to that is that it's actually the opposite. When people register here with the Call It Out register, when they make a complaint in the workplace, when they take an action, it's not just that thing that happened that day or an incident that happened that week. It is a repeated pattern of behaviour, is a repeated assault on Indigenous people, where people get to a point that they no longer wish to tolerate that. And I think as Indigenous people, we have a very high tolerance for racism. If we were reporting every incident, as people sometimes allege, we'd be very, very busy people. So when you look at these stories, and when we go into these discussions, I would hope that people keep that in mind, that these are, I think, genuinely tip of the iceberg types of things, and that there's a lot more going on, and we'll get to that as part of our discussion. To end on a more positive note, I would also point out that we need to understand I use the word insidious in my introduction, and I use that a couple of times because it is quite insidious. It's easily denied, easily dismissed. It's not a physical thing that you can grab and hold and physically pull apart, but its effects are very real. And I think part of combating that is educating ourselves on the many ways in which it expresses itself and what we can do to respond to that. And this report, I think, helps that education and puts us in a stronger position to respond. So now we'll get on to some introductions. Uncle Dale Ruska, welcome. Uncle Dale is a Gonpul, Jundawal, Yuggera Guri man with ancestral ties to the Gubbi Gubbi, Ngunnawal and Turrbal peoples. Uncle Dale has been a dedicated advocate for First Nations sovereignty and justice since his journey began in the 1970s through grassroots activism. His work is inspired by his family's deep involvement in Aboriginal rights movements, and throughout his career he has played a pivotal role in land rights struggles. Uncle Dale's current roles include chairperson of the 1 Mile Residents Aboriginal Corporation and director at Minjarrabah Mulgumpin Elders in Council Aboriginal Corporation, where he chairs the Social and Youth Justice Group. I'm sorry if I mangled any of those words, Uncle Dale, but welcome to the panel today. Also joining the panel is Associate Professor Fiona Allison. Fiona is an Associate Professor here at Jumbunna Research, whose work centres on working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities to improve their civil and family law access to justice, including in the area of race discrimination and criminal justice outcomes through community-led justice reinvestment approaches. Welcome, Fiona. And finally, Professor Chris Cunneen. Chris is a leading criminologist specialising in First Nations people and the law, juvenile justice, restorative justice, policing, prison issues and human rights. Welcome, Chris. So that's our panel. And to kick us off, Fiona and Chris, can you tell us a bit about how and why Call It Out was created and share some of the insights from this report?
Thanks, Lyndon. And I think Aisha is going to put up a PowerPoint that we'll go through. But just to start off with, look, I want to, well, first of all, acknowledge that I'm coming from Darug and Gundagara country, unceded country, to about 120 kilometres to the west of Sydney. And the second acknowledgement I want to make is to all the people who contributed to the Call It Out register over the period that we're looking at here from 2023 through to 2024. And we want to say to people, even if we don't reference your specific report to Call It Out, we have read through them all, we've looked at them all, and we thank you for the time that you've spent making that contribution to the Call It Out register. And I'll just say very quickly, the Call It Out register is unique for a number of reasons. It is an independent Indigenous controlled platform, and it's distinct from any other collection of information around racism or those bodies which collect and act on traditional complaints and legal processes. It allows people who've directly experienced racism to report, but it also allows their family and their friends to make reports, and it also allows for witnesses of racism to make reports, and that's unique. And the other thing that's unique about the register is that, in recognition that not everyone either has the time or the ability to be able to write out what has happened to them, we also have a facility where they can orally record that, where they can record it, and then we can listen to it. And so I think that makes it a unique contribution, really, to understanding the nature of racism against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia. And very briefly, the purpose for us to setting it up, well, the purpose is to inform anti-racism action. And, we've been inspired over the years by going back to the 1960s from the freedom rides of that time, that, we don't just collect information for the sake of collecting information, but it's really to inform and inspire and assist in community activism. And that's an important reason why we set this up. It's also to raise community education and awareness in the wider community about the nature of racism, and to assist in terms of advocacy and in addressing racism and supporting law and policy reform. So this annual report covers the period from March 2023 through to March 2024. And during that period of time, we had 453 registrations. Aisha, if you want to go to the next one, thanks. A third of those were self-reports from people who directly experienced racism, and the remainder were lodged by First Nations and other witnesses of racism or friends of relatives. It's really important to recognise that this is just the number of registrations. It's not individual incidents of racism. As Lyndon's already alluded to, by the time someone actually goes to make a complaint, there's often a very long history behind that. And even with one single registration, it might cover a number of incidents, or it might cover a long period of time, as some of those quotes show there. So it's an undercount, a significant undercount of actual incidents of racism. And it's also an undercount of the victims or the people who've suffered from racism. So many of these incidents that are recorded affect whole families, particularly if it's a child at school who's been the victim of racism. That impacts on the much broader family unit and extended family. So it is much greater number than 453 if we're thinking about the incidents and the number of people that are affected by it. If you want to go on to the next slide, thanks. So the types of racism, what was reported, so negative attitudes, stereotyping, discrimination. Fiona's going to go through all of these in more detail. So with discrimination, that includes, for example, the dismissal of and denial of racism. And in fact, the idea that comes out strongly in some of those incidents that are reported is that racism is denied, and it's simply a matter that all Australians should be sticking together. Well, the one that I particularly liked underneath that was racism towards any race is unacceptable, especially towards white people, because I'm personally white. A classic statement, if you like, of reverse racism and that kind of white fragility in terms of the denial of racism. And also just the denial that comes out of racism in relation to racism as an effect of colonisation more broadly. Now, I'll pass it over to Fiona. She's going on to talk about other types of racism that was recorded, institutional racism, and so on.
Thanks so much, Chris. And I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm on unceded Widjabul country. The Widjabul people are part of the Bundjalung Nation, so I'm up in the top of New South Wales. So yeah, I'm going to run through in a bit more detail some of the types of racism that have been recorded on the register. And we're going to start with institutional racism. What we reported last year with institutional racism is that the numbers only tell part of the story. So we ask in different parts of the register questions about institutional racism, and the statistical responses we get to, the extent to which it's occurring vary across those different questions. For example, if we ask people, about the type of racism experienced, institutional racism comes up in 9% of reports. But if we talk about the location of racism, government and private institutions come up in, nearly 1 in 4 reports. And when we think about workplace-related racism and media-related racism, which are also types of racism that come up quite a lot, or location of racism that comes up quite a lot, there is quite a lot of institutional racism sitting in that as well. We think that part of the issue and Lindon spoke to this, is that people might not fully understand what falls under the umbrella of institutional racism. So one thing we've done in this report is just try to unpack that in a little bit more detail. For example, we've talked in the report about how systems or institutions that treat Aboriginal people differently, but also in the same way as others, can actually lead to racism. And that's including with respect to law, policy and practice. So the example we've got up on the screen here is a report made by a First Nations mother who talked about attending health services, mainstream health services, and her sense that she was being subjected to over surveillance in that system, and she was really worried about her baby that was going to be born being removed. Similarly, we had another report about First Nations mothers having to attend the same health services to birth their babies as others. And in the context of this real genuine fear of child removal, that was also identified as racism. The other thing that came up, we had a report about an individual, a midwife, that had disregarded the birth plan of a Wiradjuri woman. And while that might look like an isolated incident, a random incident that an individual has perpetrated, we discuss in the report how these actions by individuals can form a pattern of behaviour that then constitutes institutional racism. It's certainly come up in the reports related to policing that's in our annual report. And the other really big one that's a very, very strong theme in the report this year, as it was last year, is institutional failure to respond appropriately and therefore to contribute to eliminating racism that's perpetrated by individuals. The quote we've got here is part of a story told by a First Nations mother about racism that was perpetrated, again, by lots of different children in school against that child. And what she said is really what she wanted was a school-wide response to that. What the school did was to present more generic anti-bullying policies to her, but she wanted the school to teach all kids about racism. And so that sort of goes to the point too that we might talk about a little bit later, is that we really need First Nations people to be identifying the solutions and responses to this issue. Thanks, Aisha. The other area that came up, I think it was in around about 11% of reports, is cultural rights, and they were being denigrated or ignored. I've just pulled one example of that out here. There was a report about a media report related to Manchester Museum in the UK returning stolen artefacts, and there was quite a lot of racist commentary that accompanied that article. For example, that the artefacts had no sort of cultural significance, and other comments like that. And something that I hope Dale might speak to, because he has presented a report to the Register, is that a really, really important point is that racial inequality for Indigenous people today, so breaches of their human rights, is very, very closely linked with past and ongoing breaches of not just cultural rights, but Indigenous rights also to land and self-determination and so on. And again, in thinking about how we address racial inequality, we have to think about how we bring those Indigenous rights into the picture, into responses. The other thing that came out really clearly was there's a high level of aggressive racism. So we've included a couple of examples here, but there's also a report in the annual report about tasering of young people by police, for example. We'll let you go into the report and read more about that, but that was certainly a big issue as well. Now, as we sort of, we do look to the stats to tell a story of racism in this country, but really, once we start unpacking all of the narratives and the accounts that are shared to the Register, we see the true extent of it. So one thing that was really clear is that there really was no safe space in terms of trying to avoid racism. And so we set that out in the report. Statistically, though, the more common locations were online and media, particularly social media, followed by public places. And we've just got one example here that kind of brings that together. And this was reported by a First Nations man who suggested that the media, with their rhetoric, anti-Aboriginal rhetoric about antisocial behaviour, had contributed by a decision to actually chase Aboriginal people out of and lock them out of a public space in the city that he lived in. And he was comparing that to how grey nomads were treated when they came into town. So these were Aboriginal people travelling into town at certain points of time rather than local residents. Workplaces last year was probably a little bit more commonly identified as the location overall for self-reports, but in this report, it's still the highest area of self-reports by First Nations people. So we've got a couple of examples here. The first one speaks to the experiences of a First Nations woman who was doing what she was asked to do and required to do, and that was sharing Indigenous perspectives in the workplace to try to upskill other staff. And as she says here, she was met with contempt. And the second quote is not an employment-related matter, but this speaks to this issue of, having nowhere to hide from racism. This Aboriginal lady received hate mail in a space that she thought was safe, which was the workplace, the Aboriginal organisation in which she was employed. And just a quick discussion, I guess, about victims and perpetrators. So we found that there was a really high proportion of perpetrators that were unknown. So this was higher than last year and potentially related to the voice. Chris will talk about that in a moment. Males were more commonly identified as perpetrators too, compared to women. But again, really, as we were saying about spaces in which racism occurs, there is no template for a racist. Anybody could be a racist, and we discussed that in the report, people from different ages, backgrounds, and so on. Victims were more commonly identified as female. For example, 60% of self-reports were from women. And all ages are targeted. So nearly 1 in 5 reports involved young victims. And the quote we've got there is again about a young victim in a school setting. But you can see here, it's about children perpetrating racism against other children. And that actually came up in quite a few reports we got this year. Thanks, Aisha. We also asked people what their emotional response was to racism, and you can see here what the more common responses were. Other responses other than anger, disappointment and sadness were isolation, distrust and feeling unsafe. And the health impacts were really, really significant as well. So we've got one quote there about someone trying to take their own life. Just that second quote down the bottom there too indicates that what happens, what the report makes really clear, and the stories that are shared to call it out make really clear, is that there's the first experience, emotional response to racism, and then that gets, those sort of emotional impacts get really badly exacerbated when there's poor responses to calling out racism. And that's, again, a very strong theme in the report. However, there were 17% collectively of reports that actually spoke to being motivated about to bring about change and feeling solidarity with others that are experiencing racism, and some people really trying to make an effort to do things that would make really broad-ranging changes. The most common response was talking with family and friends, but other proactive responses were also pretty frequently reported, and that is people verbally defending themselves, going to anti-discrimination bodies and potentially to police. And we have a category of other responses, and in there we saw a whole lot of reports being made to unions and online platforms and so on. And as was the case last year, call it out is still the preferred response, but we also saw some reports coming in of people feeling I suppose, their self-esteem was really affected by the fact that they felt that they couldn't call it out. They couldn't call racism out. And we got quite a lot of comments about that as well, feeling like they were letting their communities down. Thanks, Aisha. So we then look in the report at barriers to calling out racism. So 10% of those responding to a question about what they'd done in relation to racism felt that nothing could be done about it. And 9% did nothing because they didn't know what to do. Some of the issues that are coming up is that, people just think it's not really worth it. They've got to, at best, what they've got to do is navigate really difficult complaints processes. And what they know they're going to encounter is little understanding of racism, its impacts, and the legal and other obligations to not perpetrate racism. So this first quote was the response that one man got in trying to confront his so-called friend about racism that he'd encountered in that relationship, and this was the response that he got. And this second quote comes from some of the comments we got to posting call it out online, is basically nobody's interested, nobody's bothered, nobody cares. At worst, the sort of repercussions that we can see in the report are people losing their jobs and so on. And there's another example here of someone being excluded from a shop because they didn't want to listen to the racist banter that was going on. And fear and power also comes up really strongly too. So this is a comment by a man travelling with a colleague in a car who was being racist and really having feeling like he couldn't actually confront this man in the car about the issues. And the last thing I just want to speak to is strategies to combat racism. So again, we heard that they need to be multi-layered, and they include education. There's a lot in there about accountability and responsibility via legal protections and sanctions. And the last thing I'll just say is that there's also some discussion in there about needing political solutions, including sovereign, autonomous self-governance. And now I'll hand over to Chris, and he's just going to talk a little bit about the voice.
Thanks, Fiona. So this period that we're covering in this report relates, 4 months of it relate to the lead up to and the referendum itself, which was on the 14th of October 2023. And there was a lot of publicity, I think, during that period around the rising levels of racism in the community, from community organisations, advocacy groups, various statutory bodies. There are notorious examples like racist cartoons in the Financial Review, no campaigners, some of the no campaigners anyway, with unfounded claims and conspiracy theories. And organisations like the E-Safety Commission, the Human Rights Commission, all identifying increases in racism. And I think probably the simplest answer to this, or the simplest response to this, was the Human Rights Commission looking back on 2023, saying that last year the Voice referendum mainstreamed a shocking level of racism for the duration of the campaign and has continued to impact on First Nations communities. So it's not surprising that in terms of the registrations, that the reports that came in to call it out, about one in five reports, of all reports, mentioned the referendum or the Voice. And about 2/3 of those were actually made by sorry, 2/3 of those were made by witnesses, and 1/3 was made by people who actually experienced racism as a result of the referendum. And I think what was interesting around that was that there was a high reporting around social media and mainstream media in terms of the location of racism, but also a significant proportion of people being confronted in public places in terms of interpersonal racism. And I mean, one of the things too that was interesting around that, of people being abused in public in relation to the referendum, was not because of their views on the referendum. In fact, their views were irrelevant to the abuse that they received. They were being abused simply because they were Aboriginal. And that in itself was what made these complaints racist. And so one woman described how she was heading off to work in her work shirt, which was for an Aboriginal organisation, so it had an Aboriginal pattern on it. And she was confronted by an older white woman who demanded to know what her position was on the referendum. And she said to the woman, I chose not to share my personal views about the vote, believing that everyone has a right to present their own views at the poll on the day. And then she started to raise a voice and started abusing the Aboriginal woman, saying that Aboriginal people were going to take away her land, take away her land that her husband had worked so hard for, and so on. And so the Aboriginal woman, tried to walk away. She said she walked away feeling ashamed and feeling embarrassed. And this white woman continued to follow her, continued abusing her. Some other people that were there also joined in with the abuse. And finally, the woman said, well, I was afraid that they would keep following me. So I went into the bathroom area and turned around to her and I said, I'm going in here to wee. Do you really want to follow me into the toilet? And at that point, the woman walked away from her and left her alone. And as the woman said, she abused me because I was wearing an Aboriginal shirt and looked Aboriginal. And there were many complaints that came in relation to that. So it wasn't about someone's position an Aboriginal person's position in relation to the referendum. It was simply being abused because they were Indigenous. People received, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people received various forms of racial abuse in the workplace. People describe receiving anonymous hate mail with insults and hate speech in relation to the voice. And there was also some of the incidents described by non-Aboriginal people where their friends expressed this sort of the cultural load, the emotional load of being Aboriginal during this period. And so one non-Aboriginal person who put in a report said that he was sitting with his friend in the park who had a Aboriginal pin in his shirt, and a random stranger came up and wanted him to explain what the voice and what the referendum was all about. And when his friend asked him after that stranger had walked away, when his friend asked him how he was dealing with everything, he talked about how difficult it was in terms of the conversations around the voice as they were ramping up. Non-Aboriginal people also put in reports in relation to receiving racist hate mail, particularly where they had something supporting a yes vote, in their house or in the front of their house. There were Aboriginal reports of graffiti, of property damage, but I think one of the major areas was around social media, and the intense, at a personal level, the intense personal abuse against First Nations people that was evident, particularly challenging their Aboriginality, and I think generally, challenging their right to speak, their right to have a view. There's some fairly well-rehearsed frames or tropes of racism, which centered around forms of denial. There was the types of complaints that were both personal and also in the mainstream media about particular Aboriginal people being too white to be Aboriginal. They weren't dark enough, or other people being accused, Aboriginal people being accused of darkening their skin to appear Aboriginal. There was a frame that was frequently mentioned about being too privileged, that Aboriginal people were already too privileged in Australia and that they were undeserving and they had not earned these privileges. And certainly that arose not only in the public arena, but also in personal spaces. And, because of time, I won't go through many of these, but there are examples of families going out for dinner, sitting in a restaurant and happening to listen to, the table next to them, put out all these sort of, typical complaints about, real Aboriginal people don't want the referendum, don't want the voice. Aboriginal people already get too much, those sort of common areas. And as the person who put that report in said, we went out for a nice, quiet family dinner and then was subjected to this sort of racist abuse from the table next to us. And of course, there were the issues around the voice itself is racist. It was racist against non-Indigenous people. So I think just in drawing this up to a close around the referendum, one of the things that came across in the reports in particular was that there was a very strong feeling expressed that the whole process around the referendum had facilitated the normalisation of racism. As a couple of people said, one was, racism is so normalised in people's attitudes and behaviours. The filters are off. It almost feels like it's okay to be racist. And another one, just ignorant white Australians emboldened since the referendum to spew their vile garbage all over social media. And just to finish with it, finish with this, I mean, it's that what comes out of these reports is this sort of sense of triumphalism, that there was a right, if you like, to denigrate Aboriginal people on the basis of their race. And one example was a kid, a 12-year-old, in a kids chat group. And for any of you who have children, you know how prevalent kids chat groups are these days. And this is the report, it's very brief. My 12-year-old nephew was involved in a group chat with his school friends, so-called last night. They made comments including, "You're a monkey. No wonder why everyone voted no. At least I have a voice. Proud to be the one who stole your land. Why are you talking? I thought everyone voted no for you to not have a voice." And that, particular example obviously had an incredible impact on the young person, but also on the whole family as a result of that. So much of the stuff that came in around the voice was really about denying the right to speak, irrespective of what your views were. And so harassment, exclusion, fear-mongering, misinformation were all sort of overwhelmingly used as techniques for actually silencing First Nations people. So I'll finish on there and I'll hand it over to Dale. So thank you, Dale. We're really looking forward to your contribution.
Might have to unmute Dale.
Wow. Great. Can you hear me now? Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Fiona and Lindon. Just before I start, I'd just like to reiterate some of Lyndon's opening words, and I'd just like to put the warning out to all those that are listening that my views and opinions may be very confronting and conflicting to their understanding and beliefs. But when I look at racism and what it involves, I see it as being something that was founded in the beginning of this colony of Australia's establishment. When terra nullius was used as the foundational legal grounds to entitle colonial occupation, it began with racist moral elements on the assumption that our people weren't entitled to be recognised for their ancient ownership of lands from the over 800 tribes comprised from at least 300 different language nation groups, and their ownership of this country for no less than 65,000 years. And when we look at what occurred after the proclamation of terra nullius, which was later proven to be incorrect, we've seen then the 1788 legal invasion of our lands begin. And for us as First Nations people, we had our own laws, we had our own moral constitutions that we'd abided by for tens of millenniums. 1788 meant the beginning of outright trespass and outright invasion of lands that were already owned. We know then that following that there was the frontier era, or the undeclared wars that were facilitated against many Aboriginal nation groups that allowed for legal genocide to occur in this country. And following that, the roundup of the survivors of the annihilation of genocide and our ancestors being put into the black camps as slaves, more or less, and then the Aboriginal protection era that forced our ancestors to have to reside in the missions under the Aboriginal protections laws. They were then followed by other laws such as assimilation, white Australia immigration, and laws that were administered over us, laws that weren't of our choice as First People, but laws that become the choices of this country and how they should address and administer Aboriginal people and administer Aboriginal land. Where I see us being now as a people and as a part of a country, we're in a place where racism has become so morally embedded into the moral constitution of the majority of the nation. And I see racism as being an acceptable, normal, moral belief and a moral practice that's based on this false assumption that whiteness is superior to blackness. And we only need to look at history and all that's occurred throughout history and how much disadvantage and intergenerational trauma that history has caused for us as the rightful owners, the first law people of this country. And how for us as the rightful owners and the first law people of this country, we're continuously legally denied recognition of our rights and our sovereignty, because we were the original sovereigns of this land, and our people were that for no less than 65,000, possibly at least 120,000 years. When we look at all of the recent times of our efforts, and throughout all that time of administrative oppression, a lot of our people didn't lie down. Some retained resilience and resistance to the injustices of the historical crimes that were legally facilitated, crimes that are still legalised right up until now, whereas some of our people were forced to become subordinate and subservient to the colony because of the extent of the oppression and the enormous impacts that was caused for their well-being. When we come to the times of recent times and recent history, we've seen how systemic racism and institutional discrimination are continuously maintained. And we look at the attempts that have resulted from Aboriginal efforts through resistance movements as well as through activism and demonstration to try and change that system of injustice to a more justice place for us as First People. But the attempts from the governing bodies to resist that change that's necessary. We've seen what occurred in the 67 referendum. We've seen what our people done in response in 71 and 72 in the gathering and the establishment of the 10 Embassy in Canberra. We've seen all these eras of resistance. We've seen the 82 Commonwealth Games demonstrations following 72. In Queensland here, we've seen 88 demonstrations to the bicentenary and the celebration. We've seen our demonstrations followed then at the Olympic Games. And it just goes on where Aboriginal people have resisted injustice. We gather every year around the nation to demonstrate against Australia celebrating Australia Day. And we're trying to encourage Australians to recognise that celebrating is a major insult, but it's also racist towards us as First Nations people who see that day as a day of grieving, a day of recognising the beginning of invasion and the beginning of the dispossession and displacement of our people from our original lands. We've also seen political solutions such as land rights and native title be developed to try and recognise some of our rights. But when we look at these legislative processes and how they've eventuated, it's more about ensuring that the rights and interests of white Australians are protected and are seen as being legitimately valid over that as the original First Nations people. And processes such as the land rights legislations and the native title legislations have been constructed and ruled on our behalf by non-Indigenous people. When I look at those processes and what they've involved, and I've experienced it as a claim applicant, which I removed myself from because of how unjust it was for me to pursue it any further, those processes force the extinguishment of our ancient land titles to our country. And enforcing the extinguishment, the only way there can be a solution or an outcome through either litigation or consent determination is if we accept extinguishment and our ancient land tenure forms are then replaced by colonial land tenure forms. When we look a lot deeper than rights, we look at things like the inquiries into Aboriginal deaths in custody that occurred in the 1990s and all of the recommendations made as a result, and the fact that hardly any of those recommendations have been implemented, and that quite a few hundred more Aboriginal people have died in custody since. That's an outright act of racism. And when we look at those systems right up until now, and how much economy is invested in the youth and criminal justice systems, and the logistics of First Nation incarceration, even though we're only around 3% of the nation's population, in the youth justice and the prison systems, our people are the highest disproportionately overrepresented population of those institutes. That cause a lot of detrimental physical and emotional harm and suffering, not just for those that are incarcerated and feel the effects of recidivism, but for their families on the outside as well. When we look at all aspects of Australia's administration, from land to resource exploitation, and to administration of society and social issues and economy as well, racism is so embedded. There's no economic justice, there's no social justice, there's no political justice, and there's no legal justice for us as First Nations people. And we just need to look at how those systems are administered and how they're represented and what the objectives of those systems are. For us as First Nations people, we see ourselves becoming divided. And that division is caused from the coercion of colonial politics and political and legal structures. And we've seen many examples of that division occur over time. And many of our people, due to the severe nature and the impacts of disadvantage and of oppression, choose to become subordinate to the colony and to just accept the laws and the systems of the colony. While some of us struggle to refuse and to retain our resilience and our resistance on behalf of our First Nation being. And in most recent times, we've seen like the referendum that's just been discussed. And for myself, and I know of other Aboriginal people similar to me, who don't consider themselves to be Australians because we retain our First Nation represented identity, that referendum to begin with was racist. And we've seen many processes in the past where it involves federal and state government processes determining what they think is best for us as First Nations people, when we have the ability ourselves to be able to determine those things for ourselves, as our ancestors have done for tens of millenniums. When we look at the referendum as an example, and my opinion of it being racist, was the colony at that time and its governing structures didn't give Aboriginal people holistically across this nation, and firstly, the opportunity to discuss and to decide whether that referendum was going to be in our best interests or not. For myself, I openly promoted that people vote no, because the way I see it is that constitution that people were encouraging our voice when our voice has never been silent. Our voice has never been silent as a people. It's involved many generations of activism, many generations of resistance, starting from the frontier era times right up until recent. And to believe that by including our voice into that constitution, a constitution which has legally condoned many, many historical crimes of injustice and still continues to facilitate legalisation of Aboriginal land theft and Aboriginal displacement and dispossession, I see that as not being the solution. If the voice would have got up for me, that would have meant legally that Australia as a colonial nation would have had the legal right to administer us as Aboriginal people and to administer our land for the rest of our days. And that would have been legalising oppression and legalising suppression of Aboriginal law. Not long after the referendum, we experienced it here in our country, and it was experienced across the state of Queensland, where the state of Queensland had been promoting for several years prior the need for pathways to treaty, truth-telling and healing. A lot of us also see that process as being very advantageous due to the shift of political and legal power in this country. And it would be no different to land rights and no different to native title, where the rules and the terms and conditions would have been determined and dictated to us about what a treaty process could involve. And again, would have further legally disadvantaged us as the rightful First Nation owners of this place. And to see the outcome of that, which was following the referendum, and I also looked at the outcome of the referendum, and I seen where the majority of each state ruled in opposition to the Yes campaign as being a clear indication, it was mentioned prior, of how morally racist this country's constituency are. And in Queensland, just under a year after the referendum, the newly elected Prime Minister, who promoted he was a proud first-generation Australian, his first political commitments was to repeal the Pathways to Treaty and the Truth-Telling and Healing Bill. And I questioned the sentiments behind his reasoning, like a lot of Aboriginal people did, but it was quite obvious to us what those sentiments were representative of. When we look at other things that occur in this country, we look at how our cultural heritage is managed and how cultural heritage and environmental protection are determined. It's all based on tangible heritage. It's based on our past, our stones, bones, and our shells, the remnants of our pre-colonial existence. There's no consideration given to our intangible heritage importance, even though a lot of Australians like to encounter that. They like to see song and dance. They like to hear the Aboriginal stories. They like to participate in smoking ceremonies. They really enjoy that flavour of intangible heritage. When it comes to our stories of ownership of land and the importance of land, intangible heritage is just totally disregarded. And I'll just give an example quickly. A sacred piece of land on our country here on Chadungari or Minjerribah, which has such highly important sacredness, put an application in for Section 10 to the Federal Minister to have that area reinstated because it was protected up until 2004 and revoked in 2016 to allow for development. Our Section 10 application was put in at a similar time to a non-Indigenous community organisation Section 10 application for the protection of an old building that had been built in the early days of the colony on our country here. It took about 3 months for heritage protection to be granted for that old building because it was a colonial heritage value. 4 years on, we're still waiting for a response from the Federal Minister for our Section 10 application for our intangible heritage protection. Also, with the heritage processes that occur for heritage protection and the ways registered heritage bodies are requested to give cultural heritage clearances to new sites that are ready to be developed or industry group developments, those processes and how they utilise and how they engage Aboriginal people to give clearance is, again, followed by illegal, from our perspective, First Nation law perspective, illegal land theft. And we see that land then being utilised without any proper recompense or restitution for the original owners. It's just accepted legally that we can be legally dispossessed of our land through a process. I see in this country illegal land theft being legalised. And these are really harsh words to use, but I see this country and how it administers. It ensures the maintenance of white supremacy and black disadvantage. And if that wasn't the case, I'd put the question out to all Australians that have established rights and interests in this country as a part of the colony, as to whether they recognise that the land they occupy is stolen land, stolen illegally off Aboriginal people that have been legally displaced and dispossessed of that land. And when I see the way this country operates, and I see the way the immigration laws operate, we also see many new immigrants come into this country and adopt racism on the assumption that the land that they are acquiring, they are entitled to because they are part of the white privilege system, whereas Aboriginal people are continuously disadvantaged as a result of how that system administrates in all aspects across this country. When I see how embedded racism is and how this assumption of this belief of white superiority to blackness and the way white supremacy operates, and even on the last invasion day, the white supremacists were out there dressed, flying their Nazi flags and that, and they were allowed to do that. There was no legal address to that. They were just warned to get off the streets and that. And this country, and the way it functions, honestly believes that they are entitled to land that have been stolen off Aboriginal people. And when they choose to do nothing about it, they are becoming involved in complicity. And for all of those
I'm so sorry, Uncle Dale.
I'll just finish.
If we can, have one question to wind up.
I'll just finish. And while people do nothing about it in this country and condone it, unfortunately, sadly, but truly, they are becoming complicit. Thank you.
I'm so sorry to interrupt, Uncle. That was so good. I really thank you for that contribution. I do wish we had more time, but I just wanted to get to one question from the audience, if I can go back and find it. It's from Scott Campbell, saying that what he's heard deeply resonates and is disheartening, and he's concerned that different forms of racism are treated unequally, with some being addressed more than others. Interested in the panel's thoughts on how we can ensure equity and justice in this space. For instance, racism against First Peoples, and we've seen a lot highlight on anti-Semitism, and rightly so. I'll just open that up very quickly to the panel, because this has been badly moderated by me and we've only got a couple of minutes. Uncle Dale, sorry to interrupt again, but did you have any thoughts on that one?
Yes, we've seen the Voice, Treaty and Truth campaigns be facilitated with nothing to prevail. Following the repeal of the Queensland Pathways to Treaty, Truth-Telling and Healing, we immediately corresponded with the federal government, requesting that the federal government prioritise First Nation-led establishment of a truth-telling commission, because I'd sort of say around 98% of the Australian constituency lack understanding of the historical truth. And it has to begin with truth. And where we see this country proudly claim the identity of Australia and celebrate it on the 26th of January each year, they need to understand what the truth of this country involves, so that they can have a clear moral understanding of what that truth means in relation to their claims of entitlement.
Thanks, Uncle Dale. Chris, Fiona, just a final quick word from you.
Partly just to follow on from what Uncle Dale said, and in relation to that question, I think it's really important to understand how people's trauma and the effects of racism are dealt with or responded to are basically a political question. And this has been well acknowledged, I think, over in a number of fields, so that what gets acknowledged and what doesn't comes back to the politics of how you respond to particular groups. And I think that resonates with what Uncle Dale's saying. And that's why I think responses to Indigenous racism against Indigenous peoples has not been dealt with to the same extent as potentially it has been in other areas.
Fiona, a quick comment to finish off.
Just to thank everyone again for the stories that they've shared to call it out, and we'll continue to report on this each year. And we would just really thank everyone for coming along and bearing witness, I guess, to the stories that we've shared today. And thank you so much to Uncle Dale, who's attended in the middle of a cyclone on Stradbroke. Thank you.
And thanks to Lindon for moderating and chairing, and for your introduction to the report, Lindon. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thanks, Uncle Dale. We wish you, be thinking of you with that cyclone coming. Fiona, Chris, thanks to Kirsten Gray for her great artwork. Another wonderful colleague we have here at Jumbunna, and to Aisha for making everything work behind the scenes. And thank you, everyone, for your time this afternoon. I'm sorry we didn't get to those questions, but it's clear that there's a lot to talk about in this space. Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thank you.